If you've spent any time listening to echoes of trust and betrayals, then you already know that the most dangerous lies are often the ones an entire community agrees to believe. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden because it's difficult to find. Sometimes it's hidden because too many people benefit from keeping it buried. Before we begin today's story, I want you to answer a question in the comments. If discovering the truth meant losing your career, your friends, and your reputation, would you still expose it? Or would you walk away and protect your own peace? By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why that question matters. My name is Maren Caldwell, and for 22 years, I worked as a journalist for the Harbor Gazette, a local newspaper in the coastal town of Windmere Bay. It wasn't the kind of newspaper that won national awards or broke international headlines. Most days we covered school board meetings, local elections, business openings, and community events. It was honest work, and I loved it. There was something deeply satisfying about telling stories that mattered to ordinary people. While larger media companies chased celebrity scandals and political drama, we focused on the lives unfolding right in our own backyard. Windmere Bay was the kind of place people dreamed about retiring to. The waterfront was lined with fishing boats and small restaurants. Historic homes overlooked the harbor. Families gathered at summer festivals, and tourists filled the town every year looking for a peaceful escape. On the surface, it was the picture of small-town charm. Residents proudly described it as the safest and friendliest community in the region. For years, I believed that description myself. By the time I turned 54, I had built a reputation as someone people trusted. Residents regularly called me with story ideas. Business owners invited me to grand openings. City officials returned my calls because they knew I reported fairly and accurately. My editor often joked that I knew more about Windmere Bay than the people running it. Looking back, that joke turned out to be far more accurate than either of us realized. The trouble began with something that seemed completely insignificant at the time. One rainy Tuesday morning, I received a phone call from a retired fisherman named Everett Boone. Everett had lived in Windmere Bay his entire life. He wasn't known for exaggeration or attention-seeking. In fact, he rarely contacted the newspaper at all. That's why his call immediately caught my attention. He sounded nervous, which was unusual for a man who had spent decades surviving storms at sea. Everett told me he had noticed something strange near one of the abandoned warehouses along the eastern docks. According to him, trucks had been arriving late at night several times a week for months. The warehouse was supposedly vacant. No active business operated there. Yet vehicles kept coming and going long after midnight. Everett initially assumed renovations were taking place, but the activity continued far longer than any construction project should have lasted. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. Ordinarily, a story about suspicious warehouse traffic wouldn't have interested me. Small towns are full of rumors, misunderstandings, and overactive imaginations. However, Everett mentioned something that changed my mind. He claimed one of the trucks belonged to a company that officially ceased operations nearly 4 years earlier. As a journalist, odd inconsistencies tend to stick in my mind. I thanked him for the information, wrote down the address, and promised to look into it when I had time. A few days later, I drove past the warehouse myself. At first glance, the building looked exactly as Everett described. The windows were boarded up, the property appeared neglected, faded signs hung crookedly on rusted fencing. If someone had told me the place had been abandoned for a decade, I would have believed them. Yet something felt off. Tire tracks covered the gravel entrance, despite several days of dry weather. More importantly, a heavy-duty security camera had been installed above one of the side entrances.
The camera bothered me. Vacant properties don't usually invest in advanced surveillance systems. Curious, I returned to the office and began reviewing property records. What I found only raised more questions. The warehouse had changed ownership 3 times within 5 years. Each transfer involved different corporate entities with no obvious connection to one another. Even stranger, all 3 companies listed the same mailing address, hundreds of miles away. The deeper I looked, the less sense the paperwork made. At that point, I should have moved on. The Harbor Gazette had limited resources, and I already had plenty of assignments demanding my attention. But journalists develop instincts after enough years in the profession. Sometimes a story simply feels wrong. Sometimes small inconsistencies form a pattern before you fully understand what the pattern means. Every instinct I possessed told me there was more to this warehouse than a simple paperwork error. Over the following weeks, I continued digging whenever I had spare time. The investigation led me through corporate records, shipping manifests, property transfers, and business registrations. Again and again, the same names appeared in different places, the same attorneys, the same accountants, the same business consultants. None of it was illegal by itself, but together it created a web of connections that seemed intentionally difficult to follow. Someone had gone to considerable effort to hide who actually controlled those properties. Then, one evening, while reviewing records in my office long after everyone else had gone home, I discovered something that made my heart stop. Buried inside a routine filing was documentation connecting the warehouse to a development project that had been approved by the town council years earlier. A project publicly celebrated as one of Windmere Bay's greatest economic successes. A project championed by some of the town's most respected leaders. Suddenly, the abandoned warehouse wasn't an isolated mystery anymore. It was connected to people with power, and that realization marked the beginning of the worst mistake of my life. The discovery should have excited me. After all, uncovering connections hidden beneath layers of paperwork was exactly the kind of work I had spent more than 2 decades doing. Instead, I felt uneasy. The development project connected to the warehouse wasn't some forgotten business venture from years ago. It was one of the most celebrated initiatives in Windmere Bay's history. Town officials had praised it as an economic turning point. Local newspapers, including my own, had published glowing stories about the jobs it supposedly created and the investment it brought into the community. Finding its name buried inside documents connected to a suspicious warehouse raised questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. The next morning, I arrived at the Harbor Gazette earlier than usual and began pulling old archives over the past decade. At first, everything appeared normal. Press releases, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, interviews with town officials, and economic reports all painted the same picture. According to public records, the project had been a tremendous success. Yet, as I examined the details more closely, I noticed something troubling. Many of the numbers didn't seem to align. Job creation figures varied dramatically from one report to another. Revenue projections changed without explanation. Several promised phases of construction appeared to have vanished entirely from public discussion. That afternoon, I scheduled interviews with several former employees connected to the project. Most declined politely. A few never returned my calls. One individual agreed to meet for coffee, but canceled less than an hour before we were supposed to sit down. At first, I assumed people were simply busy. Then, I noticed a pattern. The moment I mentioned the warehouse, conversations ended. People who had been friendly suddenly became cautious. Some sounded nervous. Others sounded outright frightened. Whatever was happening, it wasn't because of a neglected building on the waterfront. It was because of something larger, hidden behind it. A week later, I finally found someone willing to talk. His name was Roland Keene, a retired contractor who had worked on several early phases of the development. We met at a diner on the edge of town where hardly anyone knew either of us. Even there, he seemed uncomfortable. Before discussing anything, he looked around the room twice and waited until our waitress walked away. The behavior struck me as excessive until he started speaking. According to Roland, portions of the project had never been completed, despite millions of dollars being allocated for construction. Contractors were paid, invoices were approved, and inspections were signed off. Yet certain facilities simply didn't exist. I asked him why nobody reported it. Roland gave a bitter laugh and explained that people did raise concerns. The problem was that every complaint seemed to disappear. Investigations stalled, audits concluded without findings, questions were redirected or ignored. Over time, most people stopped asking. He admitted that he had considered going public years earlier, but feared losing future contracts and damaging relationships that supported his business. Listening to him, I began understanding how corruption survives. It doesn't require everyone to participate. It only requires enough people to remain silent. The more I investigated, the more frequently certain names appeared. Town council members, business executives, consultants, attorneys, individuals who occupied respected positions throughout the community seemed connected through an intricate network of partnerships and financial arrangements. None of the connections were illegal by themselves. In fact, many appeared perfectly legitimate. Yet when viewed together, they suggested a small group of influential people had spent years directing projects, approving contracts, and benefiting from decisions that received little public scrutiny.
As my investigation expanded, strange things started happening. Anonymous emails appeared in my inbox warning me to stop digging. Someone began calling the newspaper office and hanging up whenever I answered. One evening, I returned to my car after interviewing a source and discovered all 4 tires had been slashed. The police treated the incident as simple vandalism, but I wasn't convinced. The timing felt too convenient. For the first time in my career, I found myself wondering whether a story was worth the personal cost it might carry. My editor, Harrison Voss, noticed the change immediately. Harrison had spent 30 years in journalism and possessed an instinct for trouble. When I explained what I was uncovering, he listened carefully without interrupting. After reviewing my notes, he leaned back in his chair and remained silent for several moments.
Finally, he admitted that some of the names appearing in my investigation concerned him. Several individuals involved held significant influence throughout the region. Challenging them would not be easy, and publishing allegations without overwhelming evidence could destroy the newspaper's credibility. Despite those concerns, Harrison agreed the story deserved further investigation. He authorized additional research time and even assigned another reporter to help verify records. For the first time, I felt encouraged. Professional journalism relies on facts, documentation, and verification. If the evidence supported what I suspected, then eventually the truth would speak for itself. At least, that's what I believed. I still hadn't learned one of the harshest lessons of my career. Sometimes, people with power don't wait for the truth to emerge. Sometimes, they attack first. That attack came sooner than I expected. On a Thursday morning, I arrived at the office to find a crowd gathered outside the building. Several television crews had parked along the street. Reporters from competing outlets stood near the entrance, speaking into cameras. Confused, I pushed through the crowd and entered the newsroom. The atmosphere inside felt completely different. Employees stared at me. Some looked shocked. Others looked uncomfortable. Nobody spoke. Then Harrison walked toward me, holding a printed document. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. Without saying a word, he handed me the paper. Across the top, in large, bold letters, was a headline accusing me of accepting bribes in exchange for favorable coverage over the past decade. The article included copies of financial records, anonymous witness statements, and allegations severe enough to destroy my career. As I scanned the pages, my heart began racing. Every accusation was false. But whoever created them had done something terrifying. They had made the lies look believable. And suddenly, I wasn't investigating the biggest story in Windmere Bay anymore. I had become part of it. The article spread through Windmere Bay faster than any story I had ever published. By lunchtime, nearly everyone in town seemed to have read it. Local radio stations discussed the allegations. Community forums exploded with speculation. Former sources stopped answering my calls. People who had greeted me warmly for years suddenly avoided eye contact when I passed them on the street. The speed of the transformation was astonishing. One day, I was a respected journalist. The next, I was the subject of the biggest scandal the town had seen in years. What made the situation especially frustrating was that the accusations had been carefully designed to appear credible. Whoever assembled the story understood exactly how to manipulate public perception. The article didn't make outrageous claims that could be easily dismissed. Instead, it mixed falsehoods with real events, legitimate documents, and carefully selected financial records. To an ordinary reader, everything seemed convincing. The allegations painted a picture of a journalist who had spent years accepting favors from developers and business leaders in exchange for positive coverage. None of it was true, but proving innocence is often far more difficult than making accusations. Harrison immediately organized an internal review. Although he believed me, he also understood the seriousness of the situation. The Harbor Gazette's reputation depended on public trust. If readers began questioning our integrity, the newspaper could suffer lasting damage. For nearly a week, accountants, attorneys, and outside consultants reviewed every expense report, financial transaction, and editorial decision connected to my work. I cooperated fully because I knew the truth would eventually emerge. Still, the process felt humiliating. After 22 years of honest journalism, I was being forced to defend my character against lies created by someone hiding in the shadows. While the review continued, I focused on something else. Instead of asking why someone targeted me, I started asking when the attack had been planned. The timing wasn't random. The accusations surfaced only after I began connecting influential figures to the warehouse investigation. That detail mattered. If someone wanted to protect a larger secret, destroying my credibility would be far easier than disproving my findings. The more I thought about it, the clearer the strategy became. They weren't responding to my investigation. They were trying to stop it before I uncovered something even more damaging. Determined to keep digging, I spent long nights reviewing records from the development project. At first, I searched for financial irregularities. Then I began examining ownership structures more closely. Many of the companies involved existed only on paper. They owned properties, received contracts, and moved money, yet had no visible employees, offices, or public presence. Several appeared to share the same attorneys and registered agents. It was like pulling on a loose thread and discovering an entire tapestry hidden behind a wall. One evening, while reviewing archived property transactions, I noticed a name that hadn't appeared before. The name belonged to a consultant called Adrian Vale. Unlike most individuals connected to the project, Adrian never appeared in public announcements or newspaper coverage. His role seemed unusually discreet, despite appearing repeatedly in business filings and corporate records. Curious, I began researching his background. What I found raised immediate concerns. Adrian had worked on development projects in 3 other towns before arriving in Windmere Bay. In each case, questions about financial irregularities surfaced years later. The pattern was impossible to ignore. In one town, public funds allocated for waterfront improvements disappeared through a network of contractors and shell companies. In another, an economic development initiative collapsed after investigators uncovered fraudulent invoices. Although Adrian was never formally charged with wrongdoing, his name consistently appeared near troubled projects. That alone didn't prove anything, but it gave me a new direction. For the first time, I felt as though I was moving closer to the people truly responsible. A breakthrough arrived from an unexpected source. Late one afternoon, I received a handwritten note slipped beneath the newspaper office door. There was no signature, no return address, and no identifying information. Inside was a simple message requesting a meeting at an old marina outside town. Under normal circumstances, I would have ignored something so vague. Given everything happening around me, however, curiosity won. The next evening, I drove to the marina and waited. The person who arrived wasn't someone I recognized. He appeared to be in his early 60s and introduced himself only as a former financial manager connected to one of the development companies. He explained that he had followed the recent news and believed I was investigating the right people. According to him, millions of dollars had been quietly redirected through a network of companies over the course of several years. Official records made everything appear legitimate, but behind the scenes, money moved through layers of transactions specifically designed to hide its destination. He had remained silent for years because he feared retaliation. For nearly 2 hours, the man described a system far larger than I imagined. Contracts were awarded to preferred businesses. Projects were intentionally over-budgeted. Certain developments existed primarily to generate opportunities for financial diversion. Most disturbing of all, he claimed several respected community leaders knew exactly what was happening. They may not have participated directly, but they benefited from keeping questions buried. Listening to him felt like watching a puzzle finally assemble itself piece by piece. Before leaving, the man handed me a flash drive. He explained that the files contained internal financial records and correspondence that could support his claims. Then he gave me a warning I still remember clearly. He said that once I reviewed the contents, I would understand why people were working so hard to destroy my reputation. According to him, the corruption wasn't limited to one warehouse, one project, or one group of investors. It extended into nearly every major development initiative completed in Windmere Bay over the past decade. That night, I sat alone in my office long after everyone else had gone home. As the files loaded onto my computer, I expected to find financial reports and transaction records. What I found instead was far worse. Emails, contracts, payment authorizations, and internal communications connected dozens of influential figures to a coordinated scheme that stretched back years. The evidence was overwhelming. The development project wasn't simply mismanaged. It had been engineered from the beginning, and buried among hundreds of documents was one name that appeared more often than any other. A name belonging to someone the entire town trusted, someone whose public reputation was even stronger than mine had ever been. The moment I saw it, I understood why they were trying so desperately to silence me. Because if the truth came out, Windmere Bay would never be the same again. I barely slept after reviewing the files on the flash drive. By sunrise, I had gone through hundreds of pages of emails, contracts, payment records, and internal correspondence. The material was far more extensive than I initially realized. It wasn't simply evidence of financial misconduct tied to one development project. It revealed a coordinated system that had operated for years. Public funds were repeatedly routed through layers of contractors and consulting firms. Projects were approved at inflated costs. Land acquisitions benefited insiders before public announcements increased property values. The deeper I looked, the more obvious it became that someone had turned community development into a private revenue machine. What shocked me most wasn't the amount of money involved. It was the identity of the person who appeared at the center of everything. The name that surfaced repeatedly belonged to Gregory Harlan, the mayor of Windmere Bay. For nearly 15 years, Gregory had been one of the most admired figures in town. He attended every community fundraiser, supported local charities, and frequently appeared in newspaper photographs shaking hands with residents and celebrating civic achievements. People trusted him. Businesses trusted him. Even I had interviewed him dozens of times over the years and never suspected what might be happening behind the scenes. Before publishing anything, I knew every claim would need overwhelming verification. The allegations were simply too serious. Harrison agreed immediately. Together, we assembled a small investigative team inside the newspaper and began cross-checking every document. We reviewed property records, tax filings, corporate registrations, and public contracts. Independent accountants examined the financial data. Attorneys reviewed the evidence for legal vulnerabilities. Every step took time, but accuracy mattered more than speed. If we were going to accuse some of the most powerful people in the region of corruption, we needed evidence that could survive intense scrutiny. As our investigation progressed, pressure began mounting from every direction. Local business leaders contacted Harrison, expressing concern about the newspaper's direction. Several advertisers quietly suspended contracts. Anonymous complaints were filed against the newspaper with regulatory agencies. One evening, someone threw a brick through the front window of my house. Fortunately, nobody was injured, but the message was unmistakable. Whoever was involved understood that we were getting close, and they wanted us to stop. Despite the intimidation, the evidence continued growing stronger. One accountant uncovered a series of payments disguised as consulting expenses that ultimately benefited individuals connected to development approvals. Another reporter identified multiple properties purchased through intermediary companies shortly before zoning changes dramatically increased their value. Each discovery reinforced the same conclusion. The corruption wasn't accidental. It wasn't the work of a few dishonest employees. It was systematic, deliberate, and highly organized. About 2 weeks later, our legal team informed us that the evidence had reached a critical threshold. We finally possessed enough verified documentation to support publication. Harrison scheduled a major investigative series for release the following Sunday. The plan involved multiple articles, supporting records, expert analysis, and detailed timelines explaining exactly how the scheme operated. It would be the largest story the Harbor Gazette had ever published. For the first time since the investigation began, I felt hopeful. The truth was finally going to reach the public. Then, everything nearly fell apart. 3 days before publication, state investigators arrived unexpectedly at the newspaper office. Someone had filed allegations claiming that our reporting relied on stolen documents and fabricated evidence. The complaint demanded an immediate review of our investigation. While the accusations lacked merit, they threatened to delay publication indefinitely. The timing wasn't coincidental. Gregory Harlan and his associates may not have known exactly what we planned to publish, but they clearly understood that something dangerous was coming. The review process created another wave of public uncertainty. Local television stations reported that the Harbor Gazette itself was under investigation. Social media erupted with speculation. Supporters of the mayor argued that our reporting was politically motivated. Others accused us of manufacturing scandals to boost circulation. Watching the public debate was frustrating because almost nobody had seen the actual evidence. People were choosing sides based on loyalty rather than facts. It reminded me how vulnerable truth becomes when powerful interests control the conversation. Fortunately, the review concluded faster than expected. Independent examiners found no evidence of fabrication, misconduct, or unethical reporting. In fact, they praised the newspaper's documentation and investigative standards. The complaint collapsed almost immediately. More importantly, the attempt to discredit us backfired. Public curiosity increased dramatically. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what story had generated such an aggressive response. By trying to suppress the investigation, our opponents had unintentionally amplified it.
Sunday morning arrived with an energy I had never experienced in my career. Thousands of copies of the Harbor Gazette sold within hours. The investigative series dominated conversations across town. Residents gathered in restaurants, coffee shops, and community centers discussing the revelations. People who had spent years trusting local leadership were suddenly confronted with evidence suggesting that trust had been exploited. Some reacted with disbelief, others with anger. Many simply felt betrayed. The fallout was immediate. State authorities announced formal investigations before the day ended. Financial records were subpoenaed, development contracts came under review. Several business executives named in the reporting hired attorneys and issued carefully worded statements denying wrongdoing. Gregory Harlan held a press conference insisting that the allegations were politically motivated and filled with inaccuracies. Yet even during his public appearance, cracks were beginning to show. Reporters challenged his explanations. Former allies grew unusually quiet. Confidence was giving way to uncertainty. Then, 48 hours after publication, everything changed again. One of Gregory's longtime associates agreed to cooperate with investigators. According to early reports, he wasn't offering minor details or limited testimony. He was providing extensive evidence and direct knowledge of how the entire operation functioned. For years, the people involved had protected one another through loyalty and mutual benefit. Now, one of them was talking. And if his information matched what investigators believed he possessed, the scandal that had already shaken Windmere Bay was about to become far bigger than anyone imagined. The cooperating witness changed everything. Within days of agreeing to work with investigators, he provided thousands of pages of records, private communications, financial transfers, meeting schedules, and internal documents that confirmed many of the findings our newspaper had already published. What had once been dismissed as allegations quickly became a roadmap for investigators. Every new document seemed to connect another piece of the puzzle. For years, powerful individuals had operated under the assumption that nobody would ever see the entire picture. Now, that picture was becoming impossible to ignore. Over the following months, state investigators expanded their inquiry far beyond the original development project. Audits uncovered millions of dollars in questionable transactions tied to multiple public initiatives. Several business executives resigned from their positions. Consulting firms that had enjoyed lucrative contracts for years suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny. Bank records, property transfers, and corporate filings revealed patterns that had remained hidden only because nobody had previously connected them together. Once investigators began pulling on the threads, entire sections of the network started unraveling. Gregory Harlan spent months publicly insisting that he had done nothing wrong. He appeared on television, attended community meetings, and repeated the same carefully crafted statements about transparency and accountability. But as additional evidence surfaced, those statements became harder to defend. Witnesses came forward, former associates contradicted his claims,
Financial records exposed transactions that could no longer be explained away as administrative errors. Eventually, even some of his strongest supporters stopped defending him. The trust that had protected him for so many years was slowly disappearing. The legal proceedings lasted nearly 18 months. During that time, Windmere Bay experienced something many communities struggle with after a major scandal. People were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about institutions they once trusted. Residents argued about responsibility, friendships fractured over political loyalties. Community meetings became emotional and sometimes hostile. Many people wanted simple villains and simple explanations, but reality rarely works that way. The corruption survived for years because too many individuals chose convenience over accountability. The scandal belonged not only to those who committed wrongdoing, but also to those who ignored warning signs when asking questions became inconvenient. As for me, life did not immediately return to normal. The accusations made against me during the investigation left scars. Although the claims were thoroughly discredited, rebuilding public trust takes time. Some people apologized for doubting me. Others never mentioned it again. A few continued believing the accusations despite overwhelming evidence proving otherwise. That was one of the hardest lessons I learned through the entire experience. Facts matter, but not everyone changes their mind when presented with them. Sometimes people become attached to the version of events they want to believe. Fortunately, the Harbor Gazette emerged stronger than anyone expected. Subscriptions increased dramatically after the investigation. Readers who had once viewed local journalism as an afterthought suddenly understood its importance. The newspaper hired additional reporters, expanded its investigative team, and invested in resources that allowed deeper reporting. For the first time in years, local journalism felt valued. Ironically, the very people who tried to destroy our credibility ended up proving why independent reporting mattered in the first place. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the first article was published, I found myself walking along the same waterfront where this entire story began. The abandoned warehouse still stood near the eastern docks, although investigators had transformed it into one of the central locations examined during the inquiry. Looking at the building, I couldn't help thinking about Everett Boone's phone call. A retired fisherman had noticed something unusual and decided to speak up. If he had ignored his instincts, none of what followed might have happened. The corruption could have continued for years. I visited Everett later that week and thanked him personally. He laughed when I told him how important his call had been. According to him, he never considered himself brave. He simply believed that when something looks wrong, someone should probably ask questions. The simplicity of that statement stayed with me. Most people imagine courage as some grand, heroic act. In reality, courage often begins with ordinary people refusing to ignore what they see. Today, Windmere Bay is still rebuilding. New leadership has replaced many of the officials involved in the scandal. Oversight procedures have improved. Public meetings attract larger audiences because residents now pay closer attention to how decisions are made. The town isn't perfect, and it never will be. No community is. But there is something healthier about a place willing to confront its mistakes rather than hide them. Progress begins when truth matters more than appearances. And perhaps that's the lesson I carried away from the most difficult chapter of my career. The people responsible for the corruption believed power would protect them forever. They believed influence, reputation, and connections could bury the truth indefinitely. What they failed to understand is that truth has a remarkable habit of surviving. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes it takes years, but eventually, hidden things have a way of finding the light. If this story reminded you of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed something that felt wrong and struggled with whether to speak up? We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who enjoys powerful tales of trust, betrayal, and justice. And remember, the biggest secrets are rarely protected by locks or walls. More often, they're protected by silence. The moment ordinary people stop being silent, everything can change.